Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be speaking at the 2022 LabRoots Laboratory Automation Seminar. My name is Dr. Christine Paszko. I'm a Senior VP here at Accelerated Technology Laboratories, and today we're going to be talking about LIMS, laboratory automation, and data integrity. Today we're going to cover a few learning objectives. The first is going to deal with the importance of data integrity. The second will deal with the acronym ALCOA as well as ALCOA Plus and the role that LIMS plays in facilitating compliance with ALCOA. And then also we'll have a discussion on the entire solution and the entire system, the role that different elements play from the quality management system to LIMS to automation to ensure that laboratories generate data with high data integrity. Okay, let's take a quick look at our agenda for today. We're going to discuss what value a LIMS offers the laboratory along with automation. What is data integrity? What defines good data quality? We'll look at the life cycle of data and then also compliance and non-compliance, and we'll also take a look at a few case studies. Now, if we look at this slide, it's basically depicting a laboratory information management system along with all the components. Integration with different instrumentation in the laboratory, integration with enterprise solutions, CDS solutions, the ability to automatically schedule sample pulls, whether it's a stability study, a shelf life study, being able to generate automated reports where the data is very easy to interpret, the QC is contained within the report, looking at metrics, warning if the temperature of the freezer is below limit, being able to automatically generate labels, and also securely being able to access that data in remote locations to increase communication throughout the organization. So think of a LIMS as really the heartbeat of the laboratory. Now, if we look at the data lifecycle, it begins with a plan, whether it's an experimental plan, an R&D plan, a work plan. So you're defining what data you'll be collecting. And then you actually go and acquire the data, whether it's manual readings or it's data that is supplied from another system and imported, or if you're acquiring it from an instrument. Often instruments are very prolific in their output, so those instruments really make sense to interface. And then you have to maintain that data to make sure that it is backed up regularly and oftentimes off-site as well. In the event that there's a fire or something at the facility, you want to make sure that that data is accessible by those people that need to have access to it. So with privileges and permissions, the users can have different roles. They can access the data that they need. And then finally, the ability to evaluate that data. So being able to look at different types of charts and graphs and statistics on that data. And then finally, when the data has been evaluated, to be able to archive that data in the event that you need to access that in the future. And then this is all with maintaining good quality assurance and quality control. One very popular automation tool is positive ID, barcodes as well as RFID. And you can see the difference between one-dimensional barcodes as well as two-dimensional, which can hold much more information, as well as radio frequency ID solutions that are ideal for applications where you have a high number of samples that you need to scan and you don't have direct access to them. Instrument integration is another tool that saves laboratories significant time and also increases the throughput. It eliminates the need for having scientists rekey in data, so it eliminates transcription errors. It increases the time to a result. The return on investment is typically 9 to 12 months. And most modern instruments can also receive a work list from the LIMS, so the samples can be organized in the LIMS with all the QC inserted. That work list can be exported to the instrument. The instrument can run the samples, and then once the run is completed, it can send the results back to the LIMS. And it also results in higher employee satisfaction because analysts don't have to spend time cutting and pasting or rekeying in data. How does it work? Basically, the output file, whether it's a comma-separated value, an Excel file, a text or ASCII or XML or something else, is sent over, and then a parser is created which places the code in the format that the LIMS is looking for. You can also pull in other types of information, whether it's from a subcontracted lab, so that all the data is in the database, and then there's an error log for anything that didn't import properly so that the LIMS administrator can take a look and see what went wrong. You can also use work lists with barcodes to quickly import the work list information. So there's a lot of different ways that barcodes can be leveraged in the laboratory. Laboratories are in business to generate data, accurate, precise, reproducible data. The next few slides, we're going to be talking about data integrity. Data integrity can be thought of as a state or a process. If we look at the process, it describes all the measures that are put in place to ensure that data is valid and accurate. So all the components of that data set in a database are valid and accurate. And this applies to things such as the standards that are used in the controls that are used in analyzing a specific sample, so that you can trace that sample back to the exact lot number of the control that was used, as well as error checking and validation methods, making sure that the data integrity processes are in place. Data integrity is a state. It defines a data set that's both valid and accurate. Now, if we take a closer look at the process, it refers to domain integrity, where the constraint is on the individual value in the SQL database, so check constraints. Entity integrity, looking at the entire table with primary keys and unique constraints. Referential integrity, the data must exist in other table, you have foreign keys, and the whole goal is to avoid bad data, which is data that's duplicated, missing, inaccurate, or incorrect. Now, if we take a look at data integrity as a state, this involves things such as technical controls, procedural controls such as standard operating procedures that are often referred to as work instructions. These can also be linked in the LIMS for ready access. Extensive use of sensors. An example would be temperature monitoring for your refrigerators, freezers, incubators, so that you have up-to-date information by the minute of the health of that equipment. Integration with different instrumentation, such as the ICP-MS, the GCs, a variety of instruments, and then also enterprise integration. So this could be with the CRM, it could be with SAP, an accounting package, making sure employees are trained as well as subject matter experts, so that you have on file copies of resumes, training certificates that they've obtained through completing various trainings, whether it's safety training, fire safety training, lab safety training. Being able to attach those training records in the LIMS so that when an auditor asks for proof of that training, it's readily accessible. Having a company culture that supports quality, CAPA, corrective and preventative actions, and making sure that there's buy-in from management as well as support. All right, what is ALCOA? Many of you may have heard of this acronym. It stands for various characteristics of good data. It's attributable. It's been documented who acquired the data, who entered or wrote it, and when. Date and timestamps in the LIMS or other electronic system. Is it legible? Can you read and understand the data and information? Is it contemporaneous? Were the records documented at the time of the activity? Is it original? Is it the first recorded observation? Is it accurate? Is the result scientifically valid and error-free? So these are the components that make up ALCOA. Now, what is ALCOA Plus? We've heard of the first 5 ALCOA. Now, ALCOA Plus adds a few, actually 4 additional characteristics. Complete, it means that all the data, including any repeat or reanalysis performed, are included. It's consistent. All the elements of the analysis, as well as date and timestamps, are in the correct sequence. It's enduring. The data is recorded as permanent. It's maintainable throughout its life cycle. And finally, that it's available. And basically that it's ready for review, inspection, or audit as long as the record exists. So this plus encompasses these 4 additional characteristics. Now we've learned what ALCOA Plus is. Now what happens when there's a violation in data integrity? If we take a look at root causes of data integrity issues, some of them include performance and business pressure. Oftentimes, organizations have invested a lot of time and money in the creation of certain products, and when they find a problem, they make a decision, should we just ship anyway or should we correct the problem? And oftentimes, higher profits and cost pressure wins over safety. So it's interesting. Later on, we'll look at a few case studies where there have been violations in ALCOA. Also, it could be a lack of awareness or capability. If the analysts that are working in the laboratory are poorly trained and they're not sure what the correct SOP they should follow is, or maybe there are no SOPs or poorly written SOPs. So training and capability. What if the organization doesn't have a culture of data integrity? There's maybe poor communication of raw material problems among workers. Maybe there's high turnover. The operating procedures are inconsistent, aren't regularly updated. So if the organization doesn't make data integrity a focus in their management principles, it may not trickle down to the entire team. And then finally, if there's inadequate processes and technology. So if there aren't any computerized systems with adequate training that people can utilize to record their data, or if there are no SOPs to be followed that are updated, there are no training records that the processes have been trained on. So here's just a few examples, and it's interesting that in 80% of the cases where there are data integrity issues, it is due to unintentional action. So only 20% are on purpose. Now, if we take a look at how we can address data integrity issues, the best is through education and communication, understanding and detecting risk, defining a strategy for data integrity and technology within the organization, and then finally, establishing a governance structure for data integrity. So it really has to do with many different components of ensuring there's high data quality generated in the organization. Now, if we take a look at some compromises in data integrity, how do these occur? Well, it can be human error. It can be transfer errors if people are cutting and pasting, or it could be accidental changing of numbers. If they're in a read only, if they're in a mode where they can accidentally hit the keyboard and change a value, it could be due to bugs or viruses or other cyber threats. It could be a disk crash or other hardware failure. Since some of the compromises can be prevented through data security, there's a strong case for backing up data the minute it's generated so that if you do have a data loss, you can go to your backup and retrieve that data. Also, input validation to make sure that invalid data isn't entered. So catching the data up front is really wise. And an example of this is if you have a pH value, for example, and you set the field to not allow any pH over 14. So you might say, the pH is between this value and this value. So if someone tries to type in a 41, it won't allow it. Error detection and data validation to identify errors in data transmission. Security measures such as data loss prevention, access control, because you don't want anyone to access that data. So with privileges and permissions, you can very carefully allow only certain people access to that data. And you may be able to have view-only control for those people that never need to have access to audit the data or change it. And then also data encryption, not only during transcription if you're using a cloud-hosted solution, but also while the data is at rest. Now let's take a look at the different types of data that can be generated. There's raw data that comes off an instrument before it's processed or undergoes any types of calculations. There's metadata, contextual information that's required to understand the data, units of measure, the date and time stamps, the user ID, the instrument ID, as well as audit trails. All right, let's talk a little bit more about audit trails. Audit trails are a history of that sample. So basically it's the who, what, when, why, where. So if a validated and approved result has been audited, the analyst needs to record a reason for the change. So it records the date, the time of the original sample and the user ID, the date and time of the new sample, the user ID, the instrument ID possibly, along with the facility that it was changed with, and most importantly, a reason for the change. Next, let's take a look at some data handling systems. There's the LIMS, Laboratory Information Management System, that can manage all the information generated within the laboratory along with all of the metadata, the reagents, supplies, chemicals used in the laboratory, the employee training record information, the instrument maintenance repair, calibration information, all the information about the sample, and then there's the CDS systems that collect all the data from the instruments, whether it's HPLC or GC, and then a data management system, which can be any system in the organization that manages data throughout part or all of the sample life cycle. Most organizations will have a variety of systems in place to ensure data quality. Now let's take a quick look at compliance. 21 CFR Part 11 deals with electronic records and electronic signatures. And it covers everything from data, text, graphics, audio, or anything that's stored in a digital form. Electronic signatures are legally binding and equivalent to handwritten signatures. And along with this, laboratories should have a written standard operating procedure in place that describes how analysts should manage and maintain their user credentials, so their username and password. It's important that these not be shared, that they're not written down on Post-it notes and placed on their computer. So it's important that that documentation is in place as well. Predictive rules are also covered under compliance. The FDA regulations require that data records are to be maintained or submitted for compliance to the FDA. CGMP, current good manufacturing practices, should be followed, and they're defined in 21 CFR Parts 210, 211, and 212. And then GXP is a general term that refers to good practices in a variety of fields, including manufacturing, laboratory, and clinical. Now, if we look at compliance a little bit more, there are technical controls, instrument hardware features that control access with usernames and passwords and permissions. There's software user authentication and authorization. There's procedural controls, so SOPs. Who is trained on the SOP is able to execute it. Rules for practice within the scope of work. And then also standard operating procedures. So these are written instructions that can be linked in the instrument controller or in the LIMS so that someone can call them up as they're executing the experiment. So they're just work instructions. Next, we're going to take a look at the compliance of the hardware and the software, the IQ, the OQ, and the PQ. The IQ is the installation qualification, and it's basically documentation that states that the software was installed on the hardware according to the vendor's instructions and that it's been verified and validated. Next is the OQ, or the operational qualification. This is basically the verification and validation of the hardware or software to perform as promised by the vendor. And finally, there's the PQ, or the performance qualification. This is documented testing and validation of the human performance of the analytical test upon the hardware and software. This is often completed by the laboratory team or a third-party validation expert. Now this slide basically shows a few of the controls in place that help to promote and enforce data integrity. We talked about the IQ, OQ, PQ, the laboratory's quality manual, document control system for author review and approval, product audit trails that require a reason if there is an audit that is spawned, customer audits and the findings of those audits, Active Directory to ensure that there's secure login, validation package with reports and risk assessments, and these can be generated within the laboratory or a third-party firm that specializes in validating commercial software. Microsoft Team Foundation server with version control for any code that's been added, and this is all enforcing electronic signatures as well as GAMP5. Now we've talked about failures in data integrity. Now let's take a look at some FDA enforcement actions that can occur. First, there can be a warning letter that can be sent to individuals or firms notifying them of specific violations and advising correction. There could be a seizure, a removal of the goods from commerce. We see this with product recalls, whether it be in the food or pharmaceutical industry. Oftentimes you'll see some for over-the-counter drugs. There can be an injunction, a court order to commence or refrain from doing a specific act or prevent violations from occurring, and there can also be criminal prosecution. Next, we're going to take a look at a few case studies and see what occurs when there isn't a culture of data integrity. We'll examine the government COVID test kit failures. I chose this example because I felt that this is something that everyone's familiar with and would be interested in learning more about. The CDC was under a lot of pressure to create a rapid test kit for COVID-19. Other countries had created them, Germany, China, South Korea. The sequence information of the coronavirus was published, so this information was available. The CDC decided that instead of having a single test against a single target, which is COVID-19, they wanted to have a single test with multiple targets. They wanted to differentiate COVID-19 from SARS-CoV, and this decision caused a lot of heartburn down the road. The CDC was under a lot of pressure to release the test kits, and they had multiple targets, so when they were creating the kits were actually made in multiple laboratories by different people, and there was poor communication among those people, and it was later determined there was a lack of training as well, and not a lot of experience in manufacturing. So they soon discovered that with the kits that were sent out to hundreds of public health facilities across the United States, that there were problems. Soon these problems were reported by the media, the New York Times, along with many other media outlets, and people started learning about failures of the test kit. When the FDA investigated, they found out that the negative control of the PCR test kit created by the CDC was contaminated, and this resulted in false positives. So people who were positive for COVID tested positive, and people who were negative for COVID tested positive. The FDA had rules in place initially to prevent any other laboratory other than the CDC from making the COVID-19 test. So at the end of February, they lifted that restriction and let other laboratories manufacture the COVID test kit because there was a huge backlog and demand for those kits. Next, we're going to examine rejected nasal swabs as part of the COVID sampling kit by the Canadian government due to mold contamination. The central Canadian government determined that nasal swabs to be used in the COVID-19 test kits were contaminated with mold. This was very disturbing because, above all, you don't want to do any harm to patients, and this could have really caused a lot of problems for patients coming in for testing. So the contaminated test kits were destroyed. They later found that there were more contaminated test kits as they started investigating. The Canadian news media started reporting on other contaminated swabs. There were also reports of contaminated PPEs, the mask as well. So there was, a lot of problems with mold, and there were also other reports of contamination with bacteria. So hopefully you can understand the importance of data integrity and testing and making sure that there's a sound quality management system in place. The impacts of bad data are staggering. First and most important, loss of life. In any outbreak, it's critical to identify those people who are infected from those who are not, and making sure you can isolate and quarantine them. Financial losses in the billions, political outfall, loss of reputation and loss of trust in the healthcare system. So it's really important to ensure that laboratories are testing, the testing is being communicated, and that the data that's being generated has high data integrity. Finally, we'll look at the vaccine development challenges by the pharmaceutical companies that all relate to product quality. It became apparent very early on that there were problems when the vaccine for COVID-19 was being manufactured. There's a plant in Baltimore that had repeated articles written about quality issues. The Baltimore facility was manufacturing vaccines for several different pharmaceutical companies. AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson were among them, and they found that there was contamination problems and many doses had to be discarded into the millions. And in the case of Johnson & Johnson production, they actually had to halt production. This was the FDA action. They had up to 15 million doses that needed to be discarded because they weren't sure of the quality and they had contamination fears. There were problems with their disinfection practices, the size and design of the facility, handling of the raw materials, training of workers. One report that I read said that the FDA stopped documenting violations because there were so many. Now, when you hear about all these cases of violations of data integrity, that does not build trust. If you look at other examples of data integrity failures, and these were just pulled from reviewing public FDA reports, there are things such as files being saved to a personal computer or a jump drive not saved on the network, sharing of passwords to save money on software licenses or just poor practices, disabling the audit trail so that results could be modified without there being any trace of it. HPL integration parameters were changed and rerun with results passing. No electronic backup of data. Unsanctioned sample testing with labels such as demo, blank, or trial. Inadequate access to controls, roles, and privileges, so software wasn't properly configured so that everyone could have access to all the data. Users would log in with a shared account and change data so no one could trace who the exact user was. So these are just a few of the findings. There are many, many more. I just wanted to highlight some examples. Next, we're going to examine a few data integrity issues that deal with raw data. So raw data is data for things such as sample weights, the preparation of standards or controls that are used in the analysis of a sample. You want to make sure there's full traceability so that you know the lot number, the expiration date, the volume that is left in that container. Also, you want to try to avoid the excessive use of Excel sheets for storing this information just because anyone can access them, and you can also change data either on accident or maliciously, and there's no audit trail. You want to make sure that there's no missing data or duplicate data, so you may not know which is the right answer. We've seen cases of people shredding data during FDA audits, and then also having data on paper logbooks, which can be destroyed or stolen. It's really important to maintain that traceability trail from all of the components and raw data from the instruments, from the reagents, the supplies in the laboratory, as well as maintaining that certificate of analysis that's basically verifying that that reagent or standard or supply has been tested and is ready for use. Okay, now we've spent a few slides looking at failures. Now let's take a look at how we can promote data integrity in an organization. We can do this by executing risk-based validation, making sure that everyone that the laboratory buys supplies and reagents from is an ISO certified laboratory, making sure that the laboratory has clear SOPs, standard operating procedures that everyone has been trained on, and the training has been documented, and if there have been any tests that have been associated with that training, they're also stored in the LIMS, making sure that audit trails are in place, and those audit trails can generate an audit report, taking a look at change control so that if something is modified, if there may be retraining required, looking at quality and IT validated systems, having a business continuity plan, so if there's a catastrophic crash of the servers, what happens? Is there a backup plan? Are there hot servers, hot spares ready to go into production? Is data located off-site? Has data integrity training been implemented in the organization? Has data been backed up? Has anyone done a test of the backup to make sure that it truly is accessible? So these are the types of things that are promoting data integrity. Now to summarize, Having bad data in your organization isn't just dangerous, it can be deadly, as we've seen in the few case studies that we've looked at. Automation enhances data quality. It really makes it easier because there are electronic date and timestamps, so you don't have to record that information manually. It takes the transcription errors out of the equation because data is transferred electronically. No one has to manually cut and paste or re-enter data into a solution. It promotes an environment that facilitates data integrity and regulatory compliance. There's a solid audit trail to protect any changes to data, and data security is there in place to prevent tampering. So only those people that have access and privileges and permissions can access that data. And the cost of bad data, it can not only financially ruin an organization, but it can hurt a company's reputation. It can cause serious harm or death for either humans or animals. I'm sure many of you have heard of the cases with melamine in pet food and infant formula and even human food. So, you know, it's really sad when people don't embrace a culture of quality because the outcome, it can be deadly. Thank you all for your time today, and I wish you all a wonderful day.